All right, it is 5 p.m. here, so we're going to get underway. Before we start, though, I'd like to welcome one of our distinguished guests tonight. We have a professor from Japan, where we have our Study Abroad program here at St. Ben's St. John's. So we welcome you here tonight. And now I'm going to turn it over to our two student moderators, Matt Lango and Meredith Jarko, to introduce Representative Drew Christensen.
All right, thank you for being on campus with us. We are excited to get some insight from you, and I'll hand it over to Matt for the first question.
All right. Was there an event or moment that pushed you into politics in general, or one that you can point to as pushing you to run for office?
I don't know that there was one specific moment. It's actually kind of interesting because I didn't grow up in a very political family. Certainly my parents were all very active citizens, but they weren't. But they weren't active really in politics very much. They were really active in the community, and I grew up being very active in the community service. It was not necessarily being involved politically, but just with community organizations. And I think I had an interest in politics from an early age, and it was really kind of just my way to serve the community to run for office. I knew I wanted to run for office someday, not necessarily when I was 20, but the seat kind of opened unexpectedly, and that was a good opportunity. And I was excited.
You just got to speak up a little bit more. Sorry, guys.
Sorry, I was excited and happy to do it. Yeah. There we go.
Thank you.
So on the topic of your age, you graduated from the U of M in 2015. So what is it like working with other representatives that are significantly older than you?
Yeah, I think it's a very good experience, and I think it's really valuable to have a lot of different perspectives in the legislature, different ages, different nationalities, different backgrounds, different ages, and I think that's what I bring to the legislature, and I've received really good responses, I think, from my colleagues that they understand that I bring a different perspective than they do, and that it's a valuable perspective. And a lot of times a perspective that they don't necessarily understand, but a perspective that they find valuable and useful in the process.
And for our audience, there's a wireless mic floating around with Richie, so if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask. Do you think your view of, things in the legislature will change as you get older or have more experience?
I don't know so much that things will change, but I think I'll just gain new perspectives and new insights on different things, and I think that it's a continual process. As I get older, I'll bring different perspectives, and as other people of different ages are in the legislature, they'll bring different perspectives to the process, and I think that's all valuable to have people from a lot of different backgrounds, and especially careers. I think it's really important that people with a lot of different professions and careers in the legislature, because they all bring different perspectives. Not just have everybody be a lawyer, but surprisingly, there are actually very few lawyers in the legislature. It's mostly people with ordinary careers that is fairly reflective, I think, of Minnesota.
So on the topic of the legislature, what is like a typical day for you at work?
A typical day. There's not a lot of typical days, which I think is one of the things I like about it. Is everything. Every day is kind of different, and there's new challenges and new exciting experiences. But a lot of my day during the legislative session is spent in committee, hearing bills, asking questions, going through the bills. And then a lot of the rest of the day is spent in my office having back-to-back 10-minute meetings with everyone under the sun that wants to meet, constituents, lobbyists, interest groups, all sorts of different people, and I'll have 12, back-to-back 10-minute meetings for 2 hours in my office, and different people have different ideas of who they take meetings with, because it's really hard to take meetings with everyone. Part of it is I I try to take a meeting with literally everyone who wants to meet with me, so sometimes it doesn't get to be a very long meeting, and sometimes the meeting is walking from my office to the House floor with me, because those are the only 8 minutes I have open that day. But I try to meet with everybody and hear everybody's perspective, and I think that's important. It's different from the legislative session, from the beginning of the legislative session to the end of the legislative session. At the beginning, almost all of our time is spent in committee hearing bills and advancing bills through the process. And then the last month or so of session, essentially all of our time is spent on the House floor debating bills and going back and forth. And then there's negotiations between the House and the Senate and the governor's office and all of that going back and forth. And then the last week or so of session, we'll literally be pulling 24-hour days on the House floor, just going at 6 a.m. We're going to recess until 7 a.m. Everybody go take a nap in their office. So it's experienced in every day is different, which I think is fun.
And we have a question from the audience.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. We really appreciate hearing from young legislators, especially because you're speaking to some people in the audience who may want to run for office someday. So it's great to hear from you in that aspect. I was wondering how, on the campaign trail, talking to potential voters, and then once you eventually got to the legislature, how you marketed yourself to either voters or fellow legislators as somebody who is young and maybe doesn't have any experience doing this sort of thing. How did you market yourself as somebody who is competent enough to make decisions for your district?
Yeah, I think I have an advantage to a certain extent in that my district, so I represent Savage and Burnsville, if I didn't say that earlier, and which are, Nash is my constituent, so.
He's taking.
Oh, I have two constituents in the room, actually. So this is Nash yelled louder initially, so. Oh man, I have tons of constituents. This is basically a town hall meeting at this point. But I think my district overall skews very young, not as young as me necessarily, but people with kind of young families, newly married, young kids. So I think it wasn't quite as dramatic then, but I was younger than them. It's kind of funny because I'm on the Aging and Long-Term Care Committee, which deals extensively with like nursing home policy and those sorts of things. So it's funny, A, that I'm 22, and B, that I don't have a single nursing home in my district, because my district is very young overall. But as far as being on the campaign trail, I think I mostly just talked about people are not necessarily, they shouldn't be satisfied with how things are usually going in St. Paul, and they don't really want more of the same. And just electing another person that seems to be the right age or seems to have the stereotypical qualifications, I don't think that's appealing to people. So I just talked about bringing a fresh perspective, focusing on solutions in St. Paul, and really I didn't hide. It wouldn't work very well to hide from my age. I just talked about how I bring a different perspective, and I think that's valuable.
And another question from the audience, Alyssa.
I was wondering, how do you balance or reconcile your interests with maybe conflicting interests of your constituents or priorities even?
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good question, and I mean that's kind of always been a question in a representative government like we have in the United States. And the way I kind of look at it is, like I was hired. My constituents hired me to go to St. Paul to vote on all these random little bills or amendments that are, people don't have time to go vote on every random bill and amendment in St. Paul because people have real lives and actual important things to do. So they hired me to go do it for them. And the way I look at that is it's my job to become as knowledgeable and as informed about the issue and how it affects my constituents and how it will affect my district, and then to make a decision based on how it's going to affect my district and my constituents, because they hired me to take the time to become as knowledgeable and as informed about the issue as I possibly can, because they don't have the time, and they shouldn't be expected to take the time to be informed on every little amendment, because that's what they hired me to do.
Kind of on that train, are there any votes or pieces of legislation that you're particularly proud of?
You know, well, Ethan Hellier is laughing in the back. Yeah, Ethan Hellier is laughing in the back there because he wanted me to talk about how there was an amendment to the liquor omnibus bill this year to allow 18-year-olds to drink in bars, and which I think 7 people voted for, and I was one of them. So he really wanted to see Nash on board.
You have all college students then.
Yeah, exactly. But so he really wanted me to talk about that. But really what I'm very proud of is a lot of the education reforms that we were able to make in this session. Education is really important to my district, and it's really a passion of mine. When I grew up in a family, my mom was a teacher, and half my family are teachers, and that's a really important thing to me. And part of the reforms that we didn't get enacted, but I was very proud to vote for, despite not being passed by the Senate or signed by the governor, are tenure reform for teachers and reforming the last in, first out policy for teachers. It becomes controversial in certain sectors, or it's controversial in St. Paul. I haven't found it to be controversial at all when I talk to average Minnesotans. It's pretty basic. In normal careers, when you're going to lay off employees, in that unfortunate instance, you lay off your least effective employees, and unfortunately that's not how things work in our public schools. And I think, what is more important than our public schools? What is more important than a good education for our kids? And not doing everything we can to ensure that our kids are receiving an outstanding education is I don't think there's a real argument for that. So I'm very proud of my efforts and my vote to reform the last in, first out policy.
Can you just explain that to keep,
Yes.
just for people that don't know that?
Yeah, so sorry, last in, first out is when school districts have to lay off teachers the way it is right now. They have to, and this is slightly a simplification, but not much of one, they have to lay off their least experienced, their least senior teachers, no matter what. So you could have a new teacher, and this has happened when I was in high school. It happens at schools all across Minnesota, that they'll have just an incredible new teacher in their second or third year, is so passionate, making such a difference in students' lives, and they have to let him or her go because they're the least senior teacher. That's what the law essentially says you have to do. In fact, in some of these school districts, if there's a tie in the seniority, they were hired on the same day or whatever it was, there's a tie in the seniority between teachers, they literally flip a coin to decide who they're going to lay off. They are not allowed to take into account who's a more effective teacher. And I think that's wrong, and I think it's letting our kids down.
I guess just on that note, how do you measure effectiveness? What's your metric for
Yeah.
If anyone didn't hear the question, he asked, how do you measure effectiveness?
So that's where a lot of the debate comes in, and that's the conversations that I'd like to have. The reforms that we were going to make this year were, in my eyes, just kind of a step in the right direction and not the end result, but it was just, all it did was allow or required that local school districts and the local teachers union would negotiate and come to an agreement over how they were going to lay off teachers. And so that, theoretically, that could be the exact same policy that they have now, but it didn't mandate it by state law that it would have to be that policy. Because right now, in state law, if you can't come to an agreement, it's automatically last in, first out, which is what the teachers union generally supports, so they just refuse to come to an agreement because then it automatically becomes something that they support. So it just force both sides to come to the bargaining table and figure out a policy that worked for them. I think there's a lot of different ways to measure effectiveness. For one, the principal, that's how it works in most people's jobs. Your boss, is who decides how effective you are, and is who decides based on a host of different results. Obviously, a concern that's a lot of times brought up is with test scores. So, because people think that we're just going to judge student or teachers' effectiveness based off their students' test scores, which rightly would not be fair because, you know, some classes are going to have, you know, more students with different challenges, like if you just moved here from, you have 5 kids in your class that just moved here from Thailand this year, obviously they're probably not going to get as high of a test score because they don't have, you know, a complete command of English yet. So, but when you have your principal and, you know, there's been talk of like peer evaluators, so having other teachers evaluate teachers, then you can use the test results as a piece of the puzzle and just look at them. And obviously, if you're actually looking into these situations, you're going to realize that this teacher, her test score, his or her test scores were not necessarily very high, but they were a huge improvement based off the students in that class's previous test scores. So that teacher made a lot of progress with those students. And that's getting down into the weeds, but I think there's a lot of good conversations we can have about how exactly we want to measure effectiveness, but that's a conversation that I want to have, and unfortunately there's a lot of people that don't even want to have that conversation.
So kind of off of that, is there any pieces of legislation in the near future that you hope to work on or help pass, especially in education because it is so important to you?
Well, that's absolutely a huge priority of mine. Unfortunately, I think it's a kind of a non-starter with the current makeup of the Senate, and the governor is very much against changing that policy. But if you have feelings about it, you could talk to him. I heard he's going to be here next Thursday, so you can let him know. But that's absolutely a huge priority of mine. As far as this upcoming session, which starts on March 8th, the 2 priorities for me are making a big investment in our roads and bridges. That's a really big issue, especially for my district. Most people that live in Savage or Burnsville don't necessarily actually work in Savage or Burnsville. They work in Minneapolis or St. Paul or Bloomington. So having roads and bridges and commute times are very important. Not, you know, obviously people's time is very valuable to them, but just all the studies with, you know, time spent in traffic, it's a drain on the economy, all of these different things. Roads and bridges, and a strong investment in that is going to be a huge priority. Especially we have about a $2 billion surplus right now. And then the other thing is some tax relief for Minnesota families. We were able to, last session, one of the governor's big priorities was to raise the gas tax, which I didn't find to be a very good idea, especially in a time where we have a lot of money, we have a large surplus in the state government. And additionally, it's a very regressive tax. It has the biggest effect on families that are just barely getting by. You know, families that make a lot of money, spending a few extra $100 a year on gas, to pay the gas tax is not going to make a huge difference. But for families that are just barely getting by, that's going to be a huge problem, and it affects everybody equally in that sense. It doesn't affect everyone equally in that sense, and I thought, you know, it's really a very unfair way to tax Minnesotans. My idea for investing in roads and bridges, because I do think that's really important, is starting to direct some of the sales tax, or all of the sales tax from the sale of auto parts and things like that are associated with people who use roads and bridges would be directed to fixing roads and bridges, which then it's a user fee, which everybody likes a user fee if the people that are actually using the service from the state are paying a large portion of the cost.
We have another audience question.
Hello, I'd like to change topics just a little bit. You ran for the state house when you were a senior in college, so I'm wondering, what were you involved in on campus that led you to choose to run, to decide to run, and describe that process?
Yeah, so I was very involved. I went to the University of Minnesota. I was really involved in college Republicans and things like that, which I think is very valuable, and I certainly made a lot of connections that way. I also, for most of my time in college, I interned and worked on Congressman Klein's campaign, who represents the area where I grew up and represent now in a lot of other areas, and kind of southeastern Minnesota and the southern metro. So I made a lot of connections that way, and then just being involved in my community growing up, I had the fortune of going to the University of Minnesota, so I lived at the University of Minnesota, but I also was able to still really be involved in the community where I grew up because it wasn't very far away. And I was involved with the local, Republican Party. I went to caucus and did all those sorts of volunteer things. And as far as getting involved and, whether you want to run for office, or whether you want to work on campaigns or work at the state capitol or in Washington, it's really, I found it's just showing up and saying yes. When somebody, can believe in and ask for volunteers, volunteer. And that leads to things later on. They need to hire staff and interns and all these different things. And really that's kind of a huge part of it, is just showing up and working hard and doing a good job. And that leads and opens a lot of doors for you. Just not anything incredible or revolutionary, it's just showing up and being involved.
Kind of along that, has it been difficult to balance starting a life, a career, getting a house with being involved with the legislator and running a campaign at the same time?
It's interesting because, so we have kind of, theoretically we have a part-time legislature in Minnesota. We have session for, 4 or 5 months out of the year. And for those 4 or 5 months, it's more than a full-time job. You're there all the time, like I said, sometimes straight through the night for days on end. So it's difficult to have a traditional job in addition to that. So that's a lot of people that serve in the legislature, as a result of that, are kind of people that work for themselves, like real estate agents, or people that have, maybe a small private law practice, or people that work for the government, because then usually it's in their contract that they have to, have flexibility to allow them to serve in the legislature. So insurance agents, things like that. And that's actually a problem, I think, to a certain extent, in that it prevents a lot of people from serving in the legislature that would probably be good members of the legislature, and it takes away a little bit from our the diversity of careers that I think is really important. So what I do right now is I actually have started doing a little bit of substitute teaching. I'm on the education committee, and we talk a lot about the achievement gap. Minnesota has a good education system, but one of kind of the dark stains on it is that we have the largest gap in the country of any state between Caucasian students and students of color. And that's something that is a huge priority of mine, and I think a lot of people at the legislature. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I started substitute teaching in Minneapolis, so I can kind of get a first-hand look at the achievement gap and how we can start finding some solutions to address that problem.
Okay, and we have another audience question.
Kind of along that line, do you have any plans perhaps for further education, maybe going back to school, or maybe one career goal you have?
I don't have any current plans to go back to school. I don't rule it out, but I used to think I wanted to go to law school. When I first went to the U and majored in political science, I thought I wanted to go to law school, but then I realized I really wanted to be a lawyer, and that, and we have a lot of lawyers right now. That's another thing, is there's the job prospects for people going to law school are not great right now, because there's just a lot of people going to law school. So I would think about potentially law school someday, but it's certainly not my plan right now.
Another audience question?
Okay. So with the presidential election coming up in November, there's a lot of strong rhetoric. He's spoken for both sides of the aisle, and maybe a lot of promises being made from candidates from both sides. What do you have to say for millennials? What advice can you give us as to how to push past that strong rhetoric?
I think strong is potentially a kind word for some of the rhetoric that we're seeing in the presidential election. Particularly from Donald Trump. I think some of the things he has said are just absolutely abhorrent. and I think are, frankly, an embarrassment to me as, I'm a proud Republican, but Donald Trump is I don't know, people can have whatever opinion they want, I guess, on Donald Trump. I'm not a fan. But I think it's important to look at candidates that want to solve problems. That's kind of why, or that is why I ran for the legislature. And I saw, leading up to when I decided to run for legislature, a lot of people in St. Paul that were running around with all these solutions in search of a problem. They're, let's do this, and then they'd almost run around trying to find a problem that their magical solution was going to fix. And that's completely backwards and not what Minnesotans expect of us. So my philosophy when I went to St. Paul was just to identify problems, like the achievement gap, like a whole host of other things, and find those problems, talk to smart people, talk to Minnesotans, and talk to people closest to the problems, and find solutions to those problems. So I think the same thing applies when you look at the presidential election. Look at somebody who's focused on finding solutions, somebody who's looking forward and not looking backward, and wants to continue to bring America into a stronger, better future, and frankly provides hope. I think a lot of people are just looking for partisan attacks and looking for who the loudest person in the room is, which Donald Trump, you win that, you're the loudest person in the room. But I want somebody who inspires people, who brings Americans together, and to look for a brighter future.
So kind of going on with that, with the presidential election coming up, what would you say is the best way for young voters to get involved in politics, like beyond just voting, how to get involved politically?
I would go to caucus on Tuesday night. You also plan on going to caucus whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And when you vote the straw poll, and then most of you probably know at caucus, you also elect delegates to a local convention, and I would encourage all of you to run. I will almost guarantee you'll win, because you'll be one of probably not very many people in the room under the age of 60, and they really, really love young people being there and young people getting involved. So you'll probably win and be the leading vote getter for your precinct's slate of delegates. So I encourage you to run, and that'll just lead to a lot of opportunities to get involved with local candidates and all those kinds of things. I mean, especially you'll probably meet. Well, if you go to the Republican caucus here, you'll meet your local legislators. They'll be there, speaking, and ask them how to get involved with their campaign or what things they're doing in St. Paul, and they'd love to have your help and to help you get involved.
What are some of your expectations for the upcoming session? Are there things we should be watching for?
I think a lot like what I said earlier, transportation and tax relief are going to be two of the really big things coming up this session. Another thing that we do in the even years are bonding bills. So that's basically the state issues bonds to borrow money to fund a whole host of different things. Some of which being roads and bridges. I think most of which should be roads and bridges, and that becomes a very kind of controversial process, partially because it takes a 3/5 majority instead of just a plain majority to pass a bonding bill. So it has to be a bipartisan vote. There has to be both Democrats and Republicans voted for it. The Republicans have a majority in the House, and the Democrats have a majority in the Senate. So in the Senate, the Democrats will have to find Republicans that are willing to vote for the bill, and vice versa in the House. So it becomes an interesting balancing act. I think a lot of times in the past, the bonding bill has become a vehicle for what I see as kind of a lot of wasteful spending. A new welcome sign for a town on Iron Range, for example. That's great that they have a welcome sign, but I'm not sure that the people of all of the state of Minnesota should pay for your town's new welcome sign. A big new bridge for that people from all over are going to use. Yes, that I think is more worthwhile expenditure. So it becomes an interesting process to see, you know, how exactly the bonding bill is structured and what's included in it. I'm certainly going to be advocating for most of it to be spent on roads and bridges. We're way behind on funding and keeping up our roads and bridges in Minnesota.
So kind of off of that, about the legislative process, what are one or two important things that you think everyone should know about Minnesota's legislative process?
I think a really good thing for people to know is just how much influence you actually have over the process. People always think, you know, I'll email a politician and it just goes into some black hole and nobody's ever going to see it. And that's maybe true if you email your congressman or senator or something like that. But if you email my house email address right now, like my phone will buzz and I'll pick it up and read it. Like, I'm going to read your email. I'm probably going to respond to it. I'm definitely going to respond to it if you're a constituent. You know, but to a certain extent, you do get hundreds and hundreds of emails, especially during sessions, so you can't always personally respond to every single one. I make sure that I personally respond to every constituent of mine. If you're not a constituent, my legislative assistant might be who's responding to you. But if you're a constituent, it's always me, you know, sometimes on my phone in committee, you know, texting back my response to your questions. So I think that's important to be accessible, especially at a local level, like the state government. You know, when you're a member of Congress, you probably can't physically answer all of your constituents personally, but I'm able to, and I think that's an important thing to do.
Other audience question?
Hi, thank you so much for coming to see us today. I have a question. So as a very young legislator, did you ever come across being stereotyped for your age, or coming across people maybe not trusting you as much, or any stereotypes you came across when you were running for House of Representative, or any stereotypes you came across? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that to a certain extent, but it was mostly just, you know, the guy who ran against me. So I ran against a guy who was 65 years old, so very clear generational divide there. So certainly he and his supporters, you know, use different stereotypes and would criticize me because of my age, but I don't necessarily see that as a sincere, deeply held belief by them. It was more just I was in the other party and they wanted to attack me. But you know, there were letters to the editor in the paper. One of them, the most memorable line was that Christensen doesn't belong in the legislature; he belongs in school. So that was I sent that lady a Christmas card though. So but you know, my mom always told me growing up, you just kill them with kindness. So that was that's what you do. But you know, so there's stuff like that, and you know, when my opponent would go around knocking on doors, he'd leave behind notes that said, "We can't let Baby Drew win," blah blah blah. But you know, whatever. I don't think stuff like that works because it was just, they didn't even believe it. It was to their political advantage to criticize me for that. And when you run for office, people are always going to find something to criticize you about. And if you're not young, it's going to mean you're too old or whatever. So it's just kind of how it goes.
I'm wondering about that same thing, but like in the legislature, are there other, you know, representative senators who treat you differently because of your age? Like, I would hope that's not a problem, but I could also see that being a challenge.
I would say it has been remarkably little of a problem. I would say it's actually been more the other way, is that people almost give more weight to my opinion because it's a different opinion than, or not necessarily a different opinion, but it's from a different perspective than most of the other people have. So even though I have less experience in certainly in the legislature and less life experience, I have a different perspective that I bring. And I think people almost listen more carefully to what I'm saying because they know that I'm not just coming from the same place that everybody else is coming from.
Another audience question?
Well, thanks for coming. I was wondering, somebody mentioned before that there's probably some people in this room who are thinking about running. I know you talked a little bit about your campus involvement. I was wondering what skills should we be looking to require now if we do want to run for the legislature? Like what should we be involved in? What maybe courses should we be looking at, or just what experiences should we be having?
I would say, so I majored in political science, but I would not necessarily say that was it certainly wasn't at all a requirement. I'm not even sure that it necessarily helped me all that much in becoming a member of the legislature. Other than that, it was certainly, I majored in that because it was an interest area, which led me to run for the legislature. But what I found most valuable was the practical experience that I got volunteering on other campaigns, working for Congressman Klein's campaign, and people will just, you could literally walk for the most part into a campaign office and be like, what can I do? And they're going to start out having you shred papers or, make phone calls, getting people out to vote. And then you're going to, demonstrate that you can very competently shred paper and, call people and tell them where to vote. And then all of a sudden you're volunteering, but you're doing all these more important things and you have more important jobs to do on the campaign as you demonstrate more competence. And I think it's just getting involved. That's where I learned essentially everything that was useful to me. And you also meet a lot of people, which politics is all about relationships and all about knowing people, and not knowing people necessarily like a bad or like negative connotation, like your family knows people or those sorts of things. It's just getting to know people through volunteering and being involved in the community. And that's honestly where I learned really everything that I needed.
Are there any state legislators that you look up to or have mentored you since you've been in the House, or I guess bigger legislators like at the federal level who you look up to and kind of want to be inspired by?
I certainly really respect Congressman Klein. Like I said, I worked on his campaign, and he is a really accomplished individual. He actually used to carry the nuclear football when Ronald Reagan was president, and it was just he commanded all Marine forces in Somalia in the early 1990s. He was just a really accomplished person, really a man of conviction and integrity, and that was something that I really look up to and admire. As far as in the legislature, it's kind of funny because I sit next to Representative Sandra Erickson from Christensen on the House floor, and I'm the Republican caucus's youngest member, and Representative Erickson is the caucus's oldest member. She's 73, and she's actually the chair of the Education Policy Committee in the House. So it's been really fun for her to mentor me, and also for us to kind of exchange perspectives. And I think we've really learned a lot from each other. Her with legislative experience, and me kind of bringing a different perspective. So I think it's really been fun and really been interesting, and people laugh too that we sit next to each other on the House floor, but it's really been a fun and an interesting experience.
Hi, thanks for coming again tonight, like everyone said. We kind of talked about what you did before and what you've done since you were elected. What did you do right after you were elected to prepare for your first committee session?
So after you win the election, it's kind of a whirlwind because there's all these different orientations and all these different things that you're expected to go to, and that are really useful and really, it's actually crazy because you just get so much mail immediately after you're elected, and you don't have official office until you're elected in the beginning of November, not sworn in until the beginning of January. So they're just sending all of this mail to your house. So I'd go to the mailbox and just take out these gigantic stacks of mail addressed to Representative Christensen, which was very odd. And then it was funny because I accidentally, plus they send it to the wrong address all the time because they're just like, it's all these interest groups or individuals that are interested in different pieces of legislation, and sometimes they get the address wrong, so they sent one piece of mail to my parents' house and addressed to the Honorable Drew Christensen, and my mom brought it into church that week. She said, "I'm an honorable you in the next week," and this is just, so that was pretty funny. It's a whirlwind, and it's really good. They really gets you involved in a lot of different policy briefings, and even once session starts, the first few hearings in every committee are just like crash courses in this is how we fund education in the state of Minnesota, and I got a book about that. It's like this thing. But this is how we do this is how we do that, and you just really kind of learn a lot of information. That's one of the just really fun things actually about serving the legislature is you learn so much about so many different things, and that's really a privilege.
So as a young Republican, what is the best way to get involved with the HRCC?
You know, so the HRCC, for those that don't know, is the House Republican Campaign Committee. So it's kind of, you've probably heard of the NRCC for Republican members of Congress, the National Republican Congressional Committee, and the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So those are the state versions, essentially, of that. But I would say the best way to get involved with your campaigns for the legislature is just talk to your local candidates. Certainly, if you go to caucus next Tuesday, you'll meet your local candidates, whether you're Democrat or Republican. I'm sure there will be whoever is running for the legislative seats on the Democrat side in this area will certainly be at caucus next Tuesday. So meeting with them and just asking them, hey, how can I help? Where can I go to help? What can I do? They are definitely going to put you in touch with ways of help. And actually, it's not necessarily fun all the time to volunteer in races that are very safe for either party. You know, who is your state representative here in
Jeff Howe.
Jeff Howe. So Jeff Howe is a pretty Republican district right here. Jeff Howe's in a very good place, but in St. Cloud, those are more swing districts. So if you really want to get a flavor for a really kind of heated, close fought campaign, right down the road in St. Cloud, there will be big close campaigns for House and Senate seats there.
So at the national level, there's obviously a lot of attention and a lot going on right now. How easy or hard is it to work with the other party, and what do you do to overcome your differences to get things done?
I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that we don't get along at all in St. Paul or in Washington, or I guess I don't know how it works in Washington, but at least in St. Paul, the bills that pass unanimously are never on the news, but there are a lot of bills that pass unanimously or pass 130 to 4, or have broad bipartisan consensus, but those aren't all that interesting necessarily. So those aren't the ones that make the evening news. It's the 5% of the bills that are hard fought and in bitter fights that are on the news. So there becomes this perspective that we just can't get along and we can't do anything, can't get anything done. And also I think that there's a personal animosity in the legislature. I get along great with tons of people from the other side of the aisle, and vice versa. We might be arguing back and forth on the floor, but at the end of the day, go out for dinner after session or whatever it is. There's not a lot of personal animosity. It's we're standing up for what we think is best for our constituents, and we understand that we might not agree with the perspective that they have, but we understand where it's coming from for the most part, and respect their right and that they were elected by their constituents to advance that idea.
Hi. A little bit ago, you mentioned how much John Klein mentored you and how much you respected him. As I'm sure you know, he's retired now, and I'd like to know your thoughts on how the election is shaping up in that district.
Yeah, so John Klein announced a few months ago that he was going to retire after this next election. So the race to replace him is in full swing. I'm currently neutral in the race, and I'm kind of evaluating it. But I think we have some good candidates. I'm a little concerned with some of the fundraising that has come in from some of the candidates. it's not necessarily the happiest thing, but it takes a lot of money to run for Congress, especially the second district is a swing district, and each of the campaigns are probably going to have to raise something like $4 million. And Angie Craig is running as the only Democrat right now, so I'm not going to talk that much about the Democrat side because it's not very contested right now, but it's contested on the Republican side, and I'm concerned that a lot of the campaign finance reports that came out in January that there wasn't really enough money being raised to catch up to the money that the other side is going to have, so I'm hopeful that candidates are able to put in a little stronger showing when the next campaign finance report comes out, because unfortunately that's is a really important thing in the race.
Hi. So you're fairly young compared to your colleagues, but what do you see in the future for yourself as a representative, or the policies with your career, anything that you foresee in the future?
So it was funny actually when John Klein announced he was retiring, they, immediately the speculation becomes, who's going to run for John Klein's seat, who's going to, in kind of the first list people pull out is the list of legislators in that district. A lot of times, Tom Emmer was a legislator before he was the congressman from up here, same thing with Michelle Bachmann, that's Eric Paulson, that's a traditional route for people to go. So people kind of pull out that list and go down the list, and so all these people were coming out with press releases saying that, announcing that they aren't going to run for Congress. So there was like 5 press releases in one day, like a few weeks after that, of people announcing that they weren't going to run for Congress. So, and I'm 22, you have to be 25 to serve in Congress, so I literally couldn't even run for Congress. But I was just like, every time I'd go on Twitter, it'd be like, so-and-so has announced they're not going to run for Congress, and it would just be like, you know what, I'm going to announce I'm not going to run for Congress. So I sent out this press release thanking the scores of Minnesotans for all their emails, phone calls, and Snapchats encouraging me to run for Congress, but I really was going to decline. So that was a funny thing, and kind of a little bit of fun I got to have with that. But right now, I'm really enjoying serving in the legislature, working on my education issues. Last in, first out is in different reforms that we can make in education is a huge passion of mine, and something that I'm really excited to keep working on in the House.
We've got 2 more questions. Hi, so thank you again. I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier a little bit about the St. Cloud races, and it actually kind of sparked my memory. I know we have one of the most expensive races in history the last time around in our district, and I'm wondering how you feel about kind of this odd escalation we're seeing and how maybe you're trying to combat it or work with it, being that, hopefully, I don't know, maybe you'll run for re-election. What are you thinking about kind of this escalation and the amount it takes to run a successful campaign, especially locally? I mean, for a local Congress seat. So thank you.
I think one of the interesting aspects of the legislative race is that it actually doesn't, as far as the money the actual candidates need to raise, it's not anything crazy. It's a few tens of thousands of dollars, which is something you can raise from, $100 from these friends and $100 from, your family, and, it adds up to a lot of money kind of in the end. But where we see the really big expenditures is from outside groups not affiliated with the candidates on both, they're not partisan per se, but they're, either liberal or conservative, and they spend, that's where the vast majority of the spending comes in. And, a lot of it is spending on negative campaigning, and people always decry negative campaigning and that sort of thing. But part of the issue, and I think a lot of people in this room understand, is negative campaigning only works when people have not taken the time to look at the issues and evaluate the issues and understand where the candidates stand on the issues. So part of the way the best way really that we can combat negative campaigning is just to inform ourselves independently, talk to the candidates, email the candidates, read about the candidates, and understand their positions on the issues. Because if you know where the candidates stand on the issues, negative campaigning is not really going to have an effect on you because, well, that's just not true. So I think that's really the most effective way that we can combat it.
I've got one more. What's it like holding a representative position with your friends and family? Do they treat you differently since you've been elected?
No. Other than they asked for, so my grandpa was a farmer and he asked that he didn't think farmers should have to pay taxes anymore. There's a lot of requests like that, but other than that, no, other than they maybe make fun of me more and potentially hold me personally responsible when there's any sort of a problem. People were very concerned that they weren't going to be able to get on a plane for their vacation because of the real ID issue, so I got a lot of calls and texts from my friends and family about that.
All right, well, I'd just like to take this time to thank Representative Drew Christensen for coming in this evening. I think we had a great event, so let's give a round of applause.